Well, thank you very much indeed for those very kind words of introduction, which are both undeserved and unexpected. Undeserved because I'm not nearly as distinguished as you may have been led to believe, and unexpected because until 2 days ago, I had no intention of being here at all. You came to listen to a reading of The Invisible Man, and the Invisible Man, as it turns out, is Father Ian Boyd, who, even as we speak, is engaged in some tussle with the passport office in Edmonton, Canada. I am not Father Boyd. I'm not even Monsieur Flambeau, a master of disguises masquerading as Father Boyd. I am merely a modest substitute for the main attraction. Invisibility is what you came for, and invisibility is what you are getting. I'm reminded of that verse in Robert Hamer's film Father Brown in 1954. Yesterday upon a stair, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away. Actually, I wish he would come back. And perhaps in the next few minutes, you will entertain the same wish yourselves. My remarks on Chesterton and freedom, in other words, are more or less impromptu. And they are open to the criticism that they are as rambling as the English country road that Chesterton himself so famously celebrated. So I ask for your forgiveness in advance. Please address all notes of censure to Father Boyd and the passport office in Edmonton, Canada. The good news is that it is easy to talk about Chesterton and freedom. And that is also the bad news. In a sense, all of Chesterton is about freedom. Its uses and abuses, its dangers and delights. Open any page of his writings, and you will find some reflection, some insight, some turn of phrase that suggests that for him, liberty in one form or another was the central preoccupation of his life. At one level, this was as much a matter of temperament as of philosophy. He was a person who enjoyed liberty, who celebrated it, who seems in his own life to have been a free man. The Chesterton of the popular imagination, beer drinking, always in the company of friends, intensely in love with ordinary people and ordinary things, impatient with interferers and busybodies and the nanny state, seems almost to personify a peculiarly English kind of freedom. And yet, at another level, he was also a man for whom freedom, as in free thought, free expression, free love, represented a problem, not a solution. He knew freedom's power and its limits. He knew its creative and destructive capacity. He knew that it could make or break us. The task of his life, the task of all our lives, was to know when to embrace freedom and when to leave it alone. Freedom is one of the most profoundly misunderstood and misused words in the English language. On Monday, I flew into Newark Liberty Airport. I've never seen less liberty in all my life. No cell phones, no smoking, line up here for 2 hours. This is liberty? Give me slavery any day. Well, none of this is surprising. Chesterton combined in uneasy tension a fundamentally liberal trust in human nature as essentially good, and a fundamentally Tory recognition of the reality of original sin, a doctrine he defined in his 1905 book, Heretics, as a belief in the permanent possibility of selfishness, which comes from the fact of having a self. Liberty was thus, for him, both the distinguishing glory of human beings made in the image and likeness of God, but also a responsibility that, improperly exercised, could banish us from paradise. He had an intense awareness of the drama of the moral life. And at the heart of that drama is freedom. All Christianity concentrates on the man at the crossroads, he wrote in his great book, Orthodoxy. Will a man take this road or that? That is the only thing to think about if you enjoy thinking. The ages are easy to think about. Anyone can think about them. The instant, he said, the instant is really awful. And it is because our religion has intensely felt the instant that it has, in literature, dealt much with battle, and in theology, dealt much with hell. It is full of danger, he said, like a boy's book. It is at an immortal crisis. There is a great deal of similarity between popular fiction and the religion of the Western people. The life of man is a story, he later wrote, an adventure story. And in our vision, the same is true even of the story of God. And we should not presume that the story must end happily. It may end very badly indeed. Free will, he said, or the moral responsibility of man, upon this sublime and perilous liberty hang heaven and hell and all the mysterious drama of the soul. Sublime and perilous liberty. There is the problem in a nutshell. Freedom as a blessing or a burden, as the gift that could lead us to heaven or hell, was Chesterton's theme. I did not really understand what was meant by liberty, he wrote in his autobiography in 1936, until I heard it called by the new name of human dignity. It was a new name to me, though it was part of a creed nearly 2,000 years old. Liberty is the God in man, he wrote in an essay called The Free Man, or, if you like, the artist. Liberty is only another name for sanctity, he wrote in the Independent Review in 1905, for liberty is altogether a mystical thing. So this notion of liberty as divine spark, as sub-creation, as human participation in the life of God, is hardly unique to Chesterton. As he said, it was part of a creed nearly 2,000 years old. But it was profoundly important to him, as it should be to us, to all of us, if we are to take seriously our dignity as children of God. The difference between freedom from and freedom for runs like a thread throughout his writing. And in the end, there is no mistaking that Chestertonian freedom is not the mere absence of constraint, but a rich, textured, creative thing. Chesterton was valiant in defense of our freedom, not to be bothered by bureaucrats and bosses and finger waggers. How he would have despised Mayor Bloomberg and his containers of soda almost as big as himself. But he deplored nannyism only because he knew what freedom is really for. In his charmingly entitled essay, Babies and Distributism, he offers one obvious application of the idea of what freedom is really for. Distributism, as some of you I'm sure know, was Chesterton's philosophy of property. It's actually his philosophy of the human person as expressed in property. The idea that widespread private property was the sign and the cause of a healthy society. And property, of course, is another example. The ownership of property, another example of liberty properly understood. So here in his charmingly entitled essay, Babies and Distributism, he offers an application of the idea of liberty properly understood. A child, he says, a child is the very sign and sacrament of personal freedom. He is a fresh, free will. He is something his parents have freely chosen to produce and which they freely agree to protect. He has been born without the intervention of any master or lord. He is a creation and a contribution. He is their own creative contribution to creation. People who prefer the mechanical pleasures to such a miracle are jaded and enslaved. They are preferring the very dregs of life to the first fountains of life. So the free man as an artist, as a kind of painter of the world, was important to him. Not least, perhaps, because Chesterton himself was a talented draftsman and a designer. God did not give us a universe, he said, but rather the materials of a universe. The world is not a picture, but a palette. It is we who turn this splendid chaos into a cosmos. So from this affirmative, celebratory, and sacramental notion of freedom, this confidence that the common man could always be trusted and that popular ideas were almost always correct, it was a short step for Chesterton to deplore materialist philosophies that denied human dignity by denying human freedom. He was a determined anti-determinist, a sworn enemy of destiny or Darwinism or any other kind of anti-human defeatism. He once reviewed a book called The Necessity of Communism by saying he had much more sympathy with the communism than the necessity. The idea that human beings are mere puppets of the forces of history struck him as a form of nihilism that paradoxically made history itself meaningless. The materialist theory of history, that all politics and ethics are the expression of economics, is a very simple fallacy, he argued. The thing most present to the mind of man is not the economic machinery necessary to his existence, but rather that existence itself. There is something that is nearer to him than livelihood, and that is life. Ancient Calvinism and modern evolutionism, he said, are essentially the same things. They are ingenious modern blasphemies against the dignity and liberty of the human soul. So much for sublime liberty. What of the perilous kind? Original sin, the old Adam, the selfishness that comes from possessing a self. Here too was freedom. Here too was an exercise of the will. But this freedom was destructive and disastrous because, self-evidently, it was the will rendered as mere willfulness, a kind of ultimate, unreasoning insolence that objected to any limit as such. The fall of man is a view of life, Chesterton said. It holds that we have misused a good world and not merely been trapped into a bad one. It refers evil back to the wrong use of the will. In Eden, he continued, there was a maximum of liberty and a minimum of veto. But some veto is essential, even to the enjoyment of liberty. Well, this is not only philosophically, but also psychologically obvious. Sensible people need rules. They like them. They go mad without them. Chesterton himself, as a matter of fact, very nearly went mad without them when, as a young man, he tried to invent some cosmic rules of his own, a new religion, and discovered, as he wrote in Orthodoxy, that those rules already existed and were called Christianity. The argument of that book, in essence, is that it is better for God to be God than for Chesterton to be God. True freedom, the freedom that really liberates, requires limitation. It requires an act of humility, an act of acceptance, an act of recognition that the physical and moral structures of the universe are discovered by us, not invented by us. The greatest sonnet cannot be more than 14 lines. The finest symphony requires symphonic form. The rules of chess are the game of chess. To forget the veto, to ignore the limit, that was how Eden was lost. Chesterton was an anarchist who liked rules. Indeed, he was an anarchist because he liked rules. Only with rules could the anarchy be enjoyed. The whole point of a holiday, he once wrote, was to be, within certain rational restraints, irresponsible. Without the rational restraints, it was not a holiday, a holy day at all. And this idea is a thread that runs through the entirety of Chesterton's work. The notion of celebration as only possible within limitation. Chesterton believed the glory of the home, the glory of a man's front door, the glory of four walls that contain him, is the glory that you can do whatever you want inside your home. You can eat your breakfast lying on the floor, he said in that wonderful passage in The Way, What's Wrong with the World. It requires limitation so that you can enjoy the splendid anarchy of the home. So, only within certain rational restraints can we be irresponsible. And irresponsibility comes in many forms, of course. The kind of ultimate unreasoning insolence that Chesterton defined and identified in our first parents, the kind of ultimate unreasoning insolence, so to speak, the pride that went before the fall, was also evident in the various kinds of progressivism and free thinking that marked his own day. And all of these forms of free thinking and progressivism were attempts to celebrate the end of limits as somehow a morally worthy end in itself. And of course, nothing much has changed since then. That's the nature of progressive thought. That's the nature of freedom of thought, improperly understood. What Chesterton wrote in his 1905 book, Heretics, could have been written today. And this is liberty misunderstood, improperly understood, liberty abused rather than used. Here's what he says. Every one of the popular modern phrases and ideals is a dodge in order to shirk the problem of what is good. We are fond of talking about liberty. That, as we talk of it, is a dodge to avoid discussing what is good. We are fond of talking about progress. That is a dodge to avoid discussing what is good. The modern man says, let us leave all of these arbitrary religious standards and embrace liberty. This is logically rendered, let us not decide what is good, but let it be considered good not to decide it. He says, the modern man, away with your old moral formulas, I am for progress. This, logically stated, means let us not settle what is good, but let us settle whether we are getting more of it. He says, neither in religion nor in morality lie the hopes of the race, but in education. This, clearly expressed, means we cannot decide what is good, but let us give it to our children. We meet, Chesterton continues, we meet every ideal of religion, patriotism, beauty, or brute pleasure with the alternative ideal of progress. That is to say, we meet every proposal of getting something we know about with an alternative proposal of getting a great deal more of what nobody knows about. Nobody, he says, nobody has any business to use the word progress until he has a definite creed and a cast iron code of morals. For Chesterton, of course, that definite creed and cast iron code of morals was to be found in Orthodox Christianity and ultimately in the Catholic Church. It was only in the Church, with its dogmas, its constraints, its apparent impediments, that real freedom was to be found. The more I considered Christianity, he wrote in Orthodoxy, the more I found that while it had had an established rule and order, the chief aim of that order was to give room for good things to run wild. When he became a Catholic, he said, he did not leave off thinking. He discovered how to think. His friend Bernard Shaw, an otherwise incorrigible rationalist, intuited some of this when writing to his own friend, the cloistered nun, Dame Laurentia McLaughlin. Let me see behind your prison bars to glimpse your world of freedom. That remark, from someone almost envious of a beatitude he could not share, recalls another from some who could and did share it. The Catholic Church is the natural home of the human spirit, wrote Hilaire Belloc to Chesterton when Chesterton was received into the church in 1922. The odd perspective picture of life, which looks like a meaningless puzzle at first, seen from that one standpoint, takes a complete order and meaning. The same idea was even more eloquently expressed by Chesterton's other great friend, Morris Baring. And it seems an appropriate note on which to end. I was received into the church on the eve of Candlemas, and it is perhaps the only act in my life I have never regretted. Every day of my life, every day I live, the church seems to me more and more wonderful. The sacraments more and more solemn and sustaining. The voice of the church, her liturgy, her rules, her discipline, her ritual, her decisions in matters of faith and morals, more and more excellent and profoundly wise and true and right. And her children stamped with something that those outside her are without. There in the church, Baring wrote, there I have found truth and reality, and everything outside her is to me compared with her as dust and shadow, space and freedom. That is what I experienced on being received. That is what I have been most conscious of ever since. That surely is the only liberty worthy of the name, and I wish it for all of us. Thank you. As you know, I'm not only merely a substitute, but merely a warm-up act. I am the invisible man made visible. But we have now a staged reading of The Invisible Man by Chesterton. The staged reading is not by Chesterton. The Invisible Man is by Chesterton. The Invisible Man comes from the first collection of Chesterton's wonderful short stories, the Father Brown stories, The Innocents of Father Brown, published in 1911. Those of you who are familiar with Chesterton may have discovered Chesterton through the Father Brown stories. Those of you who are unfamiliar with Chesterton are warmly encouraged to read the Father Brown stories. I think they are a splendid introduction to Chesterton. All of Chesterton can be seen in any of Chesterton. You simply open a page of Chesterton and you will find something which seems to be so typical of his writing, so typical of his work, so typical of his view of the world. The Father Brown stories are like that. They are like that in that what you see is a worldview brilliantly summarized. Chesterton was a profoundly intelligent man, but more than that, he was a profoundly wise man. One of the great fallacies of progressivism is the assumption that intelligence and wisdom are one and the same thing. I've met some profoundly unwise, intelligent people. Chesterton was both profoundly intelligent and profoundly wise. And some of that intelligence, a great deal of that intelligence, is evident in the Father Brown stories. Sometimes people talk about the Father Brown stories as if, and I think rightly, there is too much going on in them. Chesterton gives us a vast amount to think about in the Father Brown stories. He will give you 5 red herrings when 2 red herrings would have been enough. Some detective stories are thin. Chesterton's detective stories are thick with suggestion and allusion and false trails and so on. So they're simply bristling with Chesterton's intelligence. In The Invisible Man, we have a very curious parable. Chesterton's short stories are essentially parables. And this is a reflection on what you might call the nature of invisibility. I won't tell you what kind of invisibility because I don't want to give the game away. There is a wonderful plot twist, which those of you who don't know the story will be delighted to discover. But it's a reflection on the nature of invisibility. And there are different kinds of invisibility. As those of you who have read Plato will know, in the second book of the Republic, there is a very striking suggestion about what would happen if we had a kind of device that would render us invisible, and how would our moral lives be changed by that invisibility. And Plato's suggestion, which is a rather alarming one, is that our notions of justice are determined primarily by the fear of being caught, so that things done invisibly are things which will happen without the possibility of sanction, without the possibility of being caught. That's not Chesterton's purpose in this little short story called The Invisible Man. But what I'm suggesting is that Plato reflected on the nature of invisibility, and you can read his reflections in the Republic. Chesterton's story begins with a strange proposal of marriage. And the proposal of marriage comes from a man called Angus. Maybe I'll read you just a little summary before we get to the point at which our two very distinguished actors are going to take up the story. It's cast, the story, in the form of a love story. And the protagonist, the man whom we meet to begin with, is called John Turnbull Angus. John Turnbull Angus is, in typical Chestertonian fashion, an artist. So many of Chesterton's heroes, so many of his protagonists are artists. Chesterton himself was an artist. A red-headed artist, that's another little Chestertonian touch. Chesterton is intensely descriptive and visual in his language. He's forever describing colors, he's forever describing sunsets, he's forever describing red-headed people and so on. Well, John Turnbull Angus is a red-headed artist, a rather wild person in some way, and he's in love with a young woman called Laura Hope. Laura Hope works in a pastry shop, and that's where he makes a rather strange proposal of marriage. And Laura explains to Angus that she's not in a position to answer or respond to that proposal of marriage for all sorts of reasons, but one of them is that she has two other suitors. One is a man called Isidore Smith, and the other is a man called James Welkin. As she explains to Angus, Smith and Welkin are unusual people, and frankly they are unusually ugly people. They are not attractive people. She was too delicate to decline their offers of marriage by telling them the truth, that they were too ugly, so she made up another reason. She has, as I say, she is a person of some delicate sensibility. She could not bring herself to explain to them that they were simply too ugly to be her husband. So what she said to them was, I can only really take seriously a man who proposes marriage to me if they have made something of themselves in the world. Well, that was a bad stratagem to employ, because of course it was simply an invitation to them to go and make something of themselves in the world. So Smith goes out to make his fortune, and he does so by inventing a kind of mechanical robot to do housework, and he calls it Smith's Silent Service. And poor Laura explains to Angus the man who made a genuine proposal of marriage, she explains to Angus that she's now rather afraid that Smith is going to turn up and claim her as his bride, because he has indeed made a fortune. He's really a millionaire. But, she says, I could put up with that, but I'm not sure that I could put up with Welkin, the other man who proposes marriage, Isidore Smith and James Welkin. Welkin is small, he's almost dwarfish, he's a tremendous walker, but like Smith, a man physically repellent to Laura Hope. And what worries her about Welkin is that she never sees him at all. She is aware of his presence. She senses him. She thinks that he is somehow or other stalking her, but she never actually sees him. So she receives 2 letters from Smith. She knows that Smith is back on the scene. And at the same time as she receives 2 letters from Smith, she hears Welkin's eerie and satanic voice. An invisible man, an invisible suitor, a frightening presence. And all of that is the scene, the setting of the scene for the reading of this short story. The short story is abbreviated, and I've just been told that I should be abbreviated. So an invisible substitute now abbreviates himself and offers the stage to 2 people a lot more interesting than I am. Thank you very much.
As Smith took the handles and they turned the great corner of the street, Angus was amused to see a gigantesque poster of Smith's Silent Service with a picture of a huge headless iron doll carrying a saucepan with the legend, "A cook who is never cross." "I use them in my own flat," said the little black-bearded man, laughing, "partly for advertisements and partly for real convenience. Honestly, and above all board, those big clockwork dolls of mine do bring your coals or claret or a timetable quicker than any live servants I've ever known, if you know which knob to press. But I'll never deny between ourselves that such servants have their disadvantages too." "Indeed," said Angus. "Is there something they can't do?" "Yes," replied Smith coolly. They can't tell me who left those threatening letters at my flat."
The man's motor was small and swift like himself. In fact, like his domestic service, it was of his own invention. If he was an advertising quack, he was one who believed in his own wares. The sense of something tiny and flying was accentuated as they swept up long white curves of road in the dead but open daylight of evening. Soon the white curves came sharper and dizzier. They were upon ascending spirals, as they say in the modern religions. For indeed, they were cresting a corner of London which is almost as precipitous as Edinburgh, if not quite so picturesque. Terrace rose above terrace, and the special tower of flats they sought rose above them all to almost Egyptian height, gilt by the level sunset. The change, as they turned the corner and entered the crescent known as Himalaya Mansions, was as abrupt as the opening of a window, for they found that pile of flats sitting above London as above a green sea of slate. Opposite to the mansions, on the other side of the gravel crescent, was a bushy enclosure, more like a steep hedge or dike than a garden, and some way below that ran a strip of artificial water, a sort of canal, like the moat of that embowered fortress. As the car swept round the crescent, it passed, at one corner, the stray stall of a man selling chestnuts, and right away at the other end of the curve, Angus could see a dim blue policeman walking slowly. These were the only human shapes in that high suburban solitude, but he had an irrational sense that they expressed the speechless poetry of London. He felt as if they were figures in a story.
The little car shot up to the right house like a bullet and shot out its owner like a bombshell. He was immediately inquiring of a tall commissionaire in shining braid, and a short porter in shirt sleeves, whether anybody or anything had been seeking his apartments. He was assured that nobody and nothing had passed these officials since his last inquiries, whereupon he and the slightly bewildered Angus were shot up in the lift like a rocket till they reached the top floor. "Just come in a minute," said the breathless Smith. "I want to show you those welcome letters. Then you might run round the corner and fetch your friend." He pressed a button concealed in the wall, and the door opened of itself. It opened on a long, commodious anteroom, of which the only arresting features, ordinarily speaking, were the rows of tall, half-human mechanical figures that stood up on both sides like tailor's dummies. Like tailor's dummies, they were headless, and like tailor's dummies, they had a handsome, unnecessary humpiness in the shoulders, and a pigeon-breasted protuberance of chest. But barring this, they were not much more like a human figure than any automatic machine at a station that is about the human height. They had two great hooks-like arms for carrying trays, and they were painted pea green or vermilion or black for convenience of distinction. In every other way, they were only automatic machines, and nobody would have looked twice at them. On this occasion, at least, nobody did. For between the two rows of these domestic dummies lay something more interesting than most of the mechanics of the world. It was a white, tattered scrap of paper, scrawled with red ink. And the agile inventor had snatched it up almost as soon as the door flew open. He handed it to Angus without a word. The red ink on it actually was not dry, and the message ran, "If you have been to see her today, I shall kill you."
There was a short silence, and then Isidore Smith said quietly, "Would you like a little whiskey? I rather feel as if I should." "Thank you. I should like a little flambeau," said Angus gloomily. "This business seems to me to be getting rather grave. I'm going round at once to fetch him." "Right you are," said the other with admirable cheerfulness. "Bring him round here as quick as you can." But as Angus closed the front door behind him, he saw Smith push back a button, and one of the clockwork images glided from its place and slid along a groove in the floor, carrying a tray with siphon and decanter. There did seem something a trifle weird about leaving the little man alone among these dead servants, who were coming to life as the door closed.
6 steps down from Smith's landing, the man in shirt sleeves was doing something with a pail. Angus stopped to extract a promise, fortified with the prospective bribe, that he would remain in that place until the return with the detective, and would keep count of any kind of stranger coming up those stairs. Dashing down to the front hall, he then laid similar charges of vigilance on the commissionaire at the front door, from whom he learned the simplifying circumstances that there was no back door. Not content with this, he captured the floating policeman and induced him to stand opposite the entrance and watch it, and finally paused an instant for a pennyworth of chestnuts and an inquiry as to the probable length of the merchant's stay in the neighborhood.
The chestnut seller, turning up the collar of his coat, told him he should probably be moving shortly, as he thought it was going to snow. Indeed, the evening was growing gray and bitter, but Angus, with all his eloquence, proceeded to nail the chestnut man to his post. "Keep yourself warm on your own chestnuts," he said earnestly. "Eat up your whole stock. I'll make it worth your while. I'll give you a sovereign if you'll wait here till I come back, and then tell me whether any man, woman, or child has gone into that house where the commissionaire is standing." He then walked away smartly with a last look at the besieged tower. "I've made a ring round that room anyhow," he said. "They can't all 4 of them be Mr. Welkin's accomplices." Lucknow Mansions were, so to speak, on a lower platform of that hill of houses, of which Himalaya Mansions might be called the peak. Mr. Flambeau's semi-official flat was on the ground floor, and presented in every way a marked contrast to the American machinery and cold hotel-like luxury of the flat of the silent service. Flambeau, who was a friend of Angus, received him in a rococo artistic den behind his office, of which the ornaments were sabers, harquebuses, Eastern curiosities, flasks of Italian wine, savage cooking pots, a plumy Persian cat, and a small, dusty-looking Roman Catholic priest who looked particularly out of place.
"This is my friend, Father Brown," said Flambeau. "I've often wanted you to meet him. Splendid weather this, a little cold for southerners like me." "Yes, I think it will keep clear," said Angus, sitting down on a violet-striped Eastern ottoman. "No," said the priest quietly, "it has begun to snow." And indeed, as he spoke, the first few flakes, foreseen by the man of chestnuts, began to drift across the darkening window pane. "Well," said Angus heavily, "I'm afraid I've come on business, and rather jumpy business at that. The fact is, Flambeau, within a stone's throw of your house is a fellow who badly wants your help. He's perpetually being haunted and threatened by an invisible enemy, a scoundrel whom nobody has even seen. As Angus proceeded to tell the whole tale of Smith and Welkin, beginning with Laura's story and going on with his own, the supernatural laugh at the corner of two empty streets, the strange, distinct words spoken in an empty room, Flambeau grew more and more vividly concerned, and the little priest seemed to be left out of it, like a piece of furniture. When it came to the scribbled stamped paper pasted on the window, Flambeau rose, seeming to fill the room with his huge shoulders. "If you don't mind," he said, "I think you had better tell me the rest on the nearest road to this man's house. It strikes me somehow that there is no time to be lost." "Delighted," said Angus, rising also, "though he's safe enough for the present, for I've set 4 men to watch the only hole to his burrow." They turned out into the street, the small priest trundling after them with the docility of a small dog. He merely said, in a cheerful way, like one making conversation, "How quick the snow gets thick on the ground."
As they threaded the steep side streets already powdered with silver, Angus finished his story, and by the time they reached the crescent with the towering flats, he had leisure to turn his attention to the 4 sentinels. The chestnut seller, both before and after receiving the sovereign, swore stubbornly that he had watched the door and seen no visitor enter. The policeman was even more emphatic. He said he had had experience of crooks of all kinds, and top hats and in rags. He wasn't so green as to expect suspicious characters to look suspicious. He looked out for anybody, and, so help him, there had been nobody. And when all 3 men gathered round the gilded commissionaire, who still stood smiling astride of the porch, the verdict was more final still. "I've got a right to ask any man, duke, or dustman what he wants in these flats," said the genial and gold-laced giant, "and I'll swear there's been nobody to ask since this gentleman went away." The unimportant Father Brown, who stood back, looking modestly at the pavement, here ventured to say meekly, "Has nobody been up and down stairs, then, since the snow began to fall? It began while we were all around at Flambeau's." "Nobody's been in here, sir. You can take it from me," said the official with beaming authority. "Then I wonder what that is," said the priest, and stared at the ground blankly like a fish. The others all looked down also, and Flambeau used a fierce exclamation and a French gesture. For it was unquestionably true that down the middle of the entrance, guarded by the man in gold lace, actually, between the arrogant, stretched legs of that colossus, ran a stringy pattern of gray footprints stamped upon the white snow. "God!" cried Angus involuntarily. "The invisible man."
Without another word, he turned and dashed up the stairs with Flambeau following. But Father Brown still stood looking about him in the snow-clad street, as if he had lost interest in his quarry. Flambeau was plainly in a mood to break down the door with his big shoulders, but the Scotchman, with more reason if less intuition, fumbled about on the frame of the door till he found the invisible button, and the door swung slowly open. It showed substantially the same serried interior. The hall had grown darker, though it was still struck here and there with the last crimson shafts of sunset, and 1 or 2 of the headless machines had been moved from their places for this or that purpose, and stood here or there about the toilet place. The green and red of their coats were all darkened in the dusk, and their likeness to human shapes slightly increased by their very shapelessness. But in the middle of them all, exactly where the paper with the red ink had lain, there lay something that looked like red ink spilt out of its bottle. But it was not red ink.
With a French combination of reason and violence, Flambeau simply said murder, and plunging into the flat, had explored every corner and cupboard of it in 5 minutes. But if he expected to find a corpse, he found none. Isidore Smith was not in the place, either dead or alive. After the most tearing search, the 2 men met each other in the outer hall, with streaming faces and staring eyes. "My friend," said Flambeau, talking French in his excitement, "not only is your murderer invisible, but he also makes invisible the murdered man." Angus looked round at the dim room full of dummies, and in some Celtic corner of his Scotch soul, a shudder started. One of the life-size stalls stood immediately overshadowing the bloodstain, summoned, perhaps, by the slain man an instant before he fell. One of the high-shouldered hooks that served the thing for arms was a little lifted, and Angus had suddenly the horrid fancy that poor Smith's own iron child had struck him down. Matter had rebelled, and these machines had killed their master. But even so, what had they done with him? "Eaten him?" said the nightmare at his ear, and he sickened for an instant at the idea of rent, human remains, absorbed and crushed into that acephalous clockwork.
He recovered his mental health by an emphatic effort and said to Flambeau, "Well, there it is. The poor fellow has evaporated like a cloud and left a red streak on the floor. The tale does not belong to this world. There is only one thing to be done, said Flambeau. Whether it belongs to this world or the other, I must go down and talk to my friend. They descended, passing the man with the pail, who again asseverated that he had let no intruder pass, down to the commissionaire and the hovering chestnut man, who rigidly reasserted their own watchfulness. But when Angus looked round for his fourth confirmation, he could not see it, and called out with some nervousness, "Where is the policeman?" "I beg your pardon," said Father Brown. "That is my fault. I just sent him down the road to investigate something that I thought worth investigating." "Well, we want him back pretty soon," said Angus abruptly, "for the wretched man upstairs has not only been murdered, but wiped out." "How?" asked the priest. "Father," said Flambeau after a pause, "upon my soul, I believe it more in your department than mine. No friend or foe has entered the house, but Smith is gone, as if stolen by the fairies. If that is not supernatural, As he spoke, they were all checked by an unusual sight. The big blue policeman came round the corner of the crescent, running. He came straight up to Brown. "You're right, sir," he panted. "They've just found poor Mr. Smith's body in the canal below." Angus put his hand wildly to his head. "Did he run down and drown himself?" he asked. "He never came down, I'll swear," said the constable, "and he wasn't drowned either, for he died of a great stab over the heart." "And yet you saw no one enter," said Flambeau in a grave voice. "Let us walk down the road a little," said the priest. As they reached the other end of the crescent, he observed abruptly, "Stupid of me. I forgot to ask the policeman something. I wonder if they found a little brown sack." "Why a light brown sack?" asked Angus, astonished. "Because if it was any other colored sack, the case must begin over again," said Father Brown. "But if it was a light brown sack, why, the case is finished." "I am pleased to hear it," said Angus with hearty irony. "It hasn't begun so far as I'm concerned." "You must tell us about it," said Flambeau with a strange, heavy simplicity like a child. Unconsciously, they were walking with quickening steps down the long sweep of road on the other side of the high crescent, Father Brown leading briskly, though in silence. At last, he said with an almost touching vagueness, "Well, I'm afraid you'll think it prosy. We always begin at the abstract end of things, and you can't begin this story anywhere else."
Have you ever noticed this, that people never answer what you say? They answer what you mean, or what they think you mean. Suppose one lady says to another in a country house, "Is anybody staying with you?" The lady doesn't answer, "Yes, the butler, the 3 footmen, the parlor maid, and so on," though the parlor maid may be in the room or the butler behind her chair. She says, "There is nobody staying with us," meaning nobody of the sort you mean. But suppose a doctor inquiring into an epidemic asks, "Who is staying in the house?" Then the lady will remember the butler, the parlor maid, and the rest. All language is used like that. You never get a question answered literally, even when you get it answered truly. When those 4 quite honest men said that no man had gone into the mansions, they did not really mean that no man had gone into them. They meant no man whom they could suspect of being your man. A man did go into the house and did come out of it, but they never noticed him. "An invisible man?" inquired Angus, raising his red eyebrows. "A mentally invisible man," said Father Brown.
A minute or two after he resumed in the same unassuming voice, like a man thinking his way, "Of course you can't think of such a man until you do think of him. That's where his cleverness comes in. But I came to think of him through 2 or 3 little things in the tale Mr. Angus told us. First, there was the fact that this Welkin went for long walks, and then there was the vast lot of stamp paper on the window. And then, most of all, there were the 2 things the young lady said, things that couldn't be true. Don't get annoyed," he added hastily, noting a sudden movement of the Scotchman's head. "She thought they were true. A person can't be quite alone in a street a second before she receives a letter. She can't be quite alone. She can't be quite alone in a street when she starts reading a letter just received. There must be somebody pretty near her. He must be mentally invisible." "Why must there be somebody near her?" asked Angus. "Because," said Father Brown, "barring carrier pigeons, somebody must have brought her the letter." "Do you really mean to say," asked Flambeau with energy, "that Welkin carried his rival's letter to this lady?" "Yes," said the priest. "Welkin carried his rival's letter to his lady. You see, he had to. "Oh, I can't stand much more of this," exploded Flambeau. "Who is this fellow? What does he look like? What is the usual get-up of a mentally invisible man?" "He is dressed rather handsomely, in red, blue, and gold," replied the priest promptly with precision. "And in this striking and even showing costume, he entered Himalayan mansions under 8 human eyes. He killed Smith in cold blood and came down into the street again, carrying the dead body in his arms." "Reverend sir," cried Angus, standing still, "are you raving mad, or am I?" "You are not mad," said Brown, "only a little unobservant. You have not noticed such a man as this, for example."
He took 3 quick strides forward and put his hand on the shoulder of an ordinary passing postman who had bustled by them unnoticed under the shade of the trees. "Nobody ever notices postmen somehow," he said thoughtfully, "yet they have passions like other men and even carry large bags where a small corpse can be stowed quite easily." The postman, instead of turning naturally, had ducked and tumbled against the garden fence. He was a lean, fair-bearded man of very ordinary appearance, but as he turned an alarmed face over his shoulder, all 3 men were fixed with an almost fiendish squint.
Flambeau went back to his sabers, purple rugs, and Persian cat, having many things to attend to. John Turnbull Angus went back to the lady at the shop, with whom that imprudent young man contrives to be extremely comfortable. But Father Brown walked those snow-covered hills under the stars for many hours with a murderer, and what they said to each other will never be known. Thank you.